I don't want to wait. Somebody's telling me I've got to hold on. It is so good to see everyone here. I had to keep my camera off during that last song so I could play air guitar in peace. I hope you've had a lovely summer, and I look forward to reconnecting with all of you and hearing about your adventures and wanderings and wonderings. A highlight of my summer was my family's visit to Keuka Lake, one of the Finger Lakes in Western New York, near where I grew up. For the past 5 or 6 years, my family and I have made the drive to visit one of my childhood friends, Marie, and her family at their lakeside home. My kids love the freedom of running in the lake, playing with their friends in the woods, trading some Pokemon cards. And Betsy and I enjoy the opportunity to catch up with other adults and with each other in the presence of the water, the rolling hills, and the wider angle view of the sky. Most years after the kids are settled in for the night, my friend's husband and I get on the motorboat and slowly putter out to the middle of the lake so that we can catch the tail end of the sunset and watch the stars come out. There's very little ambient light in the middle of the lake, and so as darkness overtakes the sky, even the most faint stars become visible. And since typically my family visits in August, we are occasionally treated to a meteor streaking across the sky. As the hours pass, and with the stars and the faint glow of the Milky Way holding our attention, Dave and I are able to connect more deeply about what's been going on in our lives, to share about complicated or traumatic childhood and family experiences, and otherwise chew on and try to solve many of the world's problems. Memories of these experiences will accompany the Keuka Lake water that I will offer into our water communion next week, when we gather again, some of us in person, to begin the new congregational year. I love that feeling of being out there in the middle of the lake, rocking gently on the water and feeling the breeze on my skin. I love staring up at the sky and reflecting on the vastness of space, the mysteries of creation, and the reality of just how small I am against this backdrop. In those moments, I can sometimes see my brain as it cycles through the astronomy and science that I think I know, trying to find an intellectual foothold that can help me understand what I'm looking at and where I fit into it all. But eventually my brain gives up and allows my heart to experience the miracle of being alive, of being aware, of being able to witness the beauty of the earth and the sky. Now, other times in that unmoored feeling of space and solitude and drifting, my mind wants reassurance that I'm safe, and my heart longs to be reconnected. In those moments, I feel very fortunate that Keuka is not a wide lake, and so the lights of homes on the shore are always in view. And I'm grateful to be with my friend, Dave, who knows his way back to shore, and more importantly, back to the dock where we will find our families once again. In those moments, I begin to marvel at the way our ancestors learned to find their way and to populate and create networks between the far reaches of this world. I call to mind some of the things I learned in Boy Scouts about Polaris, the North Star, about growth of moss on the north side of trees, or about orienteering and using a compass and its magnetic pull to find a way. And then it dawns on me that knowing which way is north can be helpful, but only if I also know where my destination is relative to where I am. In those moments, it dawns on me that if I were dropped into the wilderness, I'm not sure I would find my way out. And friends, as thrilled as I am to be here with you again this morning, I gotta say that I'd hoped we'd be out of the wilderness by now. I don't know if anybody else can relate to that feeling. The last time I was with you, it felt like the next normal that was just around the corner was going to look something like home for many of us. A return to life that resembles what it was before the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic. Changed, yes, and maybe even improved by the lessons we learned and commitments we made during this time to community care and accessibility and to economic and racial justice. And yet still a return, a reemergence, and a reunion with some of the people, places, and experiences that we have missed. And just perhaps a lifting of the weight of seemingly impossible choices and a respite from the resulting decision fatigue. I know my comrades in parenting are especially feeling this last part as we await for a vaccine for children and as we struggle to discern what is best for our kids, whatever that means on a given day or in a given hour. And yet, here we are in the middle of another wilderness brought about by a seemingly avoidable surge of the Delta variant. A wilderness that continues to be further beset by ecological and environmental crises, humanitarian and political disasters, and economic and racial and reproductive injustice. A wilderness through which there seems no easy escape. Beloveds, this morning I find myself wondering, how can we together find our way when it feels like there is no way? I want to lift up one small thing I learned in a class this summer. Our English word discern comes from the Greek word diakrisis. Dia is a prefix that means passing through, and crisis means crisis. So friends, another way to ask my question is, how can we discern the best path forward? How can we find our way through crisis when it seems all paths are fraught with danger? How can we navigate through this time when we feel like every time we find a possible path home, it gets obscured or obstructed? This summer, my curiosity about ancient navigation led me to learn about the Pacific Islanders who first discovered and then settled and then built vibrant trade networks among islands that are hundreds of miles apart in the vast ocean. Islands that are most often out of sight beyond the horizon. Perhaps not surprisingly, for centuries, Eurocentric anthropologists and scholars have dismissed or glossed over the skill and science of the ancient Pacific navigators, suggesting instead that humans settled these islands by mistake or happenstance. This has been proven untrue. The reality is these sailors in the vast Pacific had developed sailing techniques that were centuries ahead of what their contemporaries were using to navigate the comparatively tiny seas of Europe. While Europeans were sailing along, clinging to the shore, Polynesians and other Asian Pacific Islanders were utilizing their vast accumulated and deeply scientific knowledge of the stars, of sea currents, and other environmental factors to make a way where many of us might think there is no way. Now, before I continue, I must lift up that while I am referring to these as ancient techniques, they are very much still in use by the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Islands. These techniques are alive and well despite the existential threats facing the people who cultivated and transmitted them through the generations. Existential threats that the industrialized Western world has created through imperial colonialism and unbridled extractive capitalism. This includes environmental degradation and rising sea levels, as well as outright genocide, like the one occurring now today in West Papua. As a people committed to collective liberation, we have a responsibility to pay attention to and be in solidarity with Asian Pacific Islanders in their modern struggles for survival. And I hope you will join me in doing this work. Now, friends, I invite you to join me back on our boat, floating under the light of the stars, wondering how we will possibly get home. How might a skilled navigator steer us towards safety? Well, first, knowing where we started is important. To navigate safely, it is important to know where you came from. Practicing this practically, this knowledge helps you track the distance you've traveled. But as the Pacific navigators remind us, it also means maintaining a connection to the traditions and accumulated wisdom of our ancestors. We are not the first people to find ourselves in the wilderness, and we will not be the last. Echoing what my colleague Vertus Robinson preached last week, every one of us is biologically descending from someone who, or some people who survived at great cost and at great effort. Perhaps we do not know their stories, but we are living and breathing proof of their survival. We can also draw on the wisdom and the experience of people to whom we are not directly related, but who have been through challenges like the one we face today. We may not be guaranteed to succeed, but we can be confident that success is possible, that pandemics can be contained, the systems of oppression can be resisted and overturned, and that joy and love and human flourishing can exist even in the midst of struggle. Knowing where we come from also can help us know where we want to go. Each journey begins for a reason or for a purpose. As with our fellow travelers in the Pacific, perhaps it's a need for resources or the exchange of goods and skills. Or perhaps it's a desire for adventure and self-differentiation. Or perhaps it is a search for safety and freedom brought about by displacement or catastrophe. Knowing where we come from helps us envision where we want to be, or at least what we hope to find when we get there. It helps us to aim beyond the horizon, to sail towards a destination that we hope will meet our needs or provide us with much needed shelter and safety. Knowing how things were before we entered into this time of pandemic allows us to envision and work for a more inclusive and just next normal. It helps us recognize what in our prior lives is worth returning to and what is worth letting go. Beloveds, knowing where we started and where we want to go are important. But in order to discern our path out of the wilderness, to make a way through crisis, we must become skilled at recognizing where we are. You see, in order to chart a safe course using the stars or a compass or the moss growing on the tree, we need to know where we are relative to where we want to be. An understanding of where we started can only help us so much. The true skill, the deep science of environmental navigation, particularly navigation according to the stars, is being able to constantly assess one's current location and utilizing a deep knowledge of environmental cues to adjust one's heading. Remember, out here in the middle of the water, our boat is subjected to the influences of the wind and the currents. And so while we may set our course towards a particular star, we must remember that our location, our context is also changing due to other forces. So perhaps we can say to ourselves in June, the numbers are trending in the right direction. The pandemic is over. It's time to take off our masks and finally stop being so careful all the time. But now, in the reality of September, we know that if we had simply followed the trajectory that seemed like it would work in June, without adjustment, to account for our changing circumstances, we wouldn't reach our goal of community care. And so we must know where we are moment to moment to know if we're using the correct guide star. But wait, there's more. Out here on our boat, unless our destination is directly north or directly south of us, our guide stars aren't fixed in the sky either. They move based on the time of day, the season, and our latitude. Perhaps this is akin to the changing science and CDC guidance that we have to rely on to get to our destination. Consider how our knowledge of the virus and our practices of safety have changed over time. This is to be expected. And I'm grateful for the medical and public health experts who are working tirelessly to help keep us safe. And yet, the changing guidance reminds us that we must continue to pay attention to our guide stars and learn how to determine when they no longer serve us. You see, this need for adaptation gets at the true genius of the Pacific navigators. They not only had the skills to detect the slightest changes in the wind and currents, they also had the benefit of the collective and accumulated wisdom of their ancestors to account for how one's location and time and space impacts the relative direction and value of the guide stars that are available to them. This, my friends, suggests how we might find our way where there seems to be no way, how we might together emerge from this time of pandemic, how we might together find our way out from underneath systems of oppression like structural racism and misogyny. It will require an honest understanding of where we started. It will require a commitment and a desire to get someplace better. And it will require that we remain constantly aware of where we are on our journey so that we might adapt in the face of changing circumstances. During one particularly difficult part of my life, I picked up a copy of the book, Start Where You Are, by the Buddhist teacher and nun, Pema Chodron. I think of it often when I feel overwhelmed by the world around me. Start where you are. Start where you are. Perhaps that's the most important thing we can do together as we go forward. The past is behind us. We can learn from it, but we can't return there. The future is cloudy and it is undetermined and outside of our control, though we can together set a course for the future we long to see. To get there, we must start here. We must be present here, now, with the people and the community around us. We must adapt and remain flexible and adjust as the uncertain future unfolds. We must hold one another in loving care and even carry one another when the journey gets tough. Beloveds, we have been traveling oh so long, and our journey continues. Let us remember where we started. Let us hope for where we long to be. And let us have the wisdom and the grace and the perseverance to make the next best choice, one after another, until we get there together. Amen. And may it be so. And now to conclude our service today, I want to share the music of the Samoan artist Opatai Fo'i and his band Te Vaka. I believe many of you will recognize the tune, and it is important to know that the song emerged from Opatai's ancestral roots in the Pacific Islands, as well as his commitments to the ongoing environmental and indigenous justice struggles throughout the region. So I hope you will appreciate the music in the spirit in which it is given, as an invocation to bless our continued journey, but also as an invitation into solidarity with the indigenous people of the Pacific Islands and around the world.